You're talking about 120,000 genocidaires in Rwandan prisons, you know, and I saw a figure, I don't know, hundreds of years to try them all. But I also believe that if you don't have justice, you won't have peace. But how, you know, it's an incredible task. How are you going to have justice with these kind of numbers? I visited some of those jails in Rwanda, and yes, the conditions are very difficult. But I must admit, I had a hard time feeling sorry for the people inside those jails because they were genocidaire, and I do hold people responsible for their actions. But you know, it's just, okay. Well, I'll stop there for the moment. Okay.
I want to get back to Albert.
That's crucial because let me just say though, it's
okay,
crucial
quickly,
what he's
Philip.
saying, because when we talk about this, true justice is impossible in a crime of this scale. It's one of the effects of this crime. It is, in a sense, one of the sub-crimes of the crime of genocide, that it makes a genuine reckoning in any way that would meet all our standards of due process for all the perpetrators genuinely impossible.
Okay. Albert, if I can come back to you, I mean, what would you like to see? What would better prove the International Criminal Tribunal a more effective tool for you in international justice? Are you of the mindset that this is really just kind of a rich man's court for poor countries, and that it's not fair if the international players that were complicit in the Rwandan genocide are not tried as well?
Well, yeah, but anyway, it's another illustration of the failure of the international community all along, ever since the 90s and all that. But it's a bit common to all the genocides anyway. I mean, everybody knew and nobody did anything. But again, I would push it in another way. What is going to happen after the mandate is over? What is going to happen even with people who have been now found guilty, you know? And also, what message is this sending to the other countries like France, like Germany, like wherever, where these guys are still around, and they're not even in jail, they're nowhere. I mean, these are questions.
Perhaps as a question Payam can answer. I mean, the mandate of this court expires at the beginning of 2010. And there are 10 cases to be tried so far in 2009. Should the mandate simply be extended so that other victims can possibly see justice as well?
Well, the problem with doing justice when there are potentially tens of thousands of perpetrators is, when do you stop? And we know that even to this day there are still people searching for Nazi war criminals here in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere. It's a very difficult balancing act. And the International Tribunal is only one among several actors that is responsible for bringing those people to justice. There were trials before the Rwandan courts. There have been trials before the courts of Belgium, Switzerland. Here in Canada, we have a trial against a genocidaire who's been found here. So one needs to look at the distribution of labor more broadly. And returning to the importance of the Rwanda Tribunal and whether trials before Rwandan courts would have been better, we should also remember that however much one can be critical of the inefficiency of the Rwanda Tribunal and a whole host of other problems, that it will be very difficult now for the revisionists to say that there were not impartial trials that have established an objective historical record. And it's very comparatively easy to write a journalistic account of what happened during the genocide, far more difficult to conduct a proper criminal investigation in those very difficult circumstances with the UN bureaucracy to add, and to end up with a verdict that can really be considered as a reflection of justice and due process. Okay. So with all those reservations, I still think we're far better off having had an international tribunal rather than not having had it.
Right. Is that any consolation to you, George?
No, well, I'm glad these guys were sentenced, of course, you know, and I wish that all the genocidaires would pay for their crimes. Of course, that we saw that's impossible. But I just somehow feel these international penal tribunals are just the international community washing its hands and trying to close the book on a story that's not over yet.
Because you think France was complicit in the genocide. There is a case against France here for committing part of that genocide.
Well, obviously, France played a role in the lead up to what was going on. I mean, the French did everything except pull the triggers of the guns of the Rwandan army in the fight against Kagame's army when Kagame invaded Rwanda in 1990. I mean, the French were there, the French trained those people, the French knew what was going on, obviously, but they're not the only ones.
And they did pull some triggers.
as Philip was saying as well.
They did pull some triggers. But I mean, I'm somewhere in between. Just for, if there is such a thing as a sober center on this thing, let me try and occupy it for a second and just say, I agree that the two main points about this international tribunal, for all of its faults, its merits are that it provided an address to which to send these genocidaires who were beyond Rwanda's reach, who had entered some sort of an international space, who were sometimes picked up by other African countries who would not have given them back to Rwanda and now could dump them at the UN, and that it also created a kind of historical record that belongs to an international community that during this set of events was unwilling to call it by its true name of genocide. But I think that one could have done that and even had a two-track system while trying to cultivate the Rwandan justice system rather than, in a sense, discrediting it as somehow or other totally tainted and partial. Because I think we all agree that there are this huge mass of people inside Rwanda whose accountability is critical to that country's progress.
I'd like to, we're down to our last almost 90 seconds.
Don't forget, Andrea, that
very quickly.
That also in Rwanda, there were a number of national trials in Rwanda, and also the so-called gacaca traditional justice mechanisms. So I don't think that it is correct to say that the Rwandan judiciary and traditional justice mechanisms had no role to play at all in reckoning with the past.
Fair enough. Albert, I'd like to ask you kind of another personal perspective question. It's our last minute. So what do you think Bagosora feels today? I mean, do you think he feels any guilt, or do you think people like he and people like him believe that they still did the right thing?
That's a very tough question, because I can't put myself in his shoes, but I think people are going that far. They really believe what they are doing. So is it really important, even for me as a Rwandan, to know what Bagosora thinks? For me, I'm just happy.
Well, because I mean, some Rwandans have testified to wanting them to understand the crimes they committed and to feel some remorse. Are they getting that justice?
I don't think at that level they can.
They can. It's not even possible.
More, I mean, the lower guys eventually that's where they can understand, because you know, the genocide ideology is something. You know, if they don't, I mean, because if they could understand, maybe they would have stopped, you know. But for me, it's really not important.
Okay. Yeah. Albert, you will have the final word for this edition of the debate. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I'd like to thank all four of our panelists so much for joining us tonight. That is all for this edition. You can always rewatch it on our website at france24.com. There's a tiny word at the top in white. It says talk. That means talk shows, and the debates can be found there. So thanks all so much for joining us, our viewers as well. Another edition then on Monday. Do join us then. Bonsoir.